And now, fellow space travelers, for another walk down biblical lane with your pal, me, BionicDance. Let's do this. So when we last left our hero Elisha, the prophet, he had just forever cursed the family line of his servant Gehazi for a wee bit of petty theft. And that brings us to 2 Kings 6. Here we go. So a bunch of the sons of the prophets go up to Elisha, who I assume is the head prophet if there's more than one, and basically tell him that where they're living really sucks. So then Elisha basically says, okay, everybody gather together your shit and let's go down to the River Jordan. We'll build our summer place there. And so they do. They pack all of their stuff into whatever passed for an SUV back in those days and drive on down to the River Jordan where they start chopping wood to make their new home. Problem is, one of Elisha's lackeys is a complete klutz and ends up dumping the head of the axe he was chopping with into the water. Oh no, master, what'll I do? That wasn't my axe, I was borrowing it from Bob. But Elisha's all, hey, chill, homie. Show me where it fell in the water. I'll go fetch it. And then Elisha performs a funky trick with a stick and makes the axe head float up out of the water. Ooh. So the king of Syria kind of wants to go to war with Israel, which is why Elisha decides to go and see the king of Israel to warn him about it. So leaving his minions behind, and hands up if you think that's going to go well, Elisha starts giving away Syrian troop positions to the Israeli king. Now this made the king of Syria grumpy. He thought he had a traitor in his midst somewhere, but when he asked his people, they said, "Nah, your majesty, wasn't us. Don't you know the king of Israel has that fortune-telling dude?" So the Syrian king tells his spies to go spy on their spy in the hopes of kidnapping him. Later his spies come back and tell him that Elisha is in some place called Dothan, which sounds like a knight in shining armor in some bad fantasy novel. So the Syrian king sends his best troops down to Dothan to surround the city in the early morning in the hopes of capturing Elisha. So one of Elisha's servants gets up to take an early morning piss, notices that the city is surrounded, and runs right back in shouting, "What do we do? What do we do?" And Elisha tells him not to worry about it because they've got a bigger army. And then he goes off to pray. "O Lord, show unto my servant the cavalry divisions we have hidden in the mountain. Open his eyes that he may see." Although actually that may not be what he said to God at all. I have checked translation after translation, and none of them have made it clear whether the chariots and cavalry that the guy has the vision of are their own or the bad guys surrounding them. It's implied both in different sections of this book. It's kind of annoying. Speaking of annoying, the enemy charged the city, and Elisha prays to the Lord to smite them with blindness, which he does. So then Elijah turns to all these blind guys and he says, fellas, you are totally attacking the wrong town. Follow me, and I'll bring you to your actual target. And like anyone in the army who just went blind while storming a castle would, they completely trust him. So trying really hard not to giggle, Elisha leads them off to Samaria, which at the time was the capital of the kingdom of Israel. Elisha tells God to whip off their blindfolds, which he does, and they realize, oh, we're in the middle of the enemy. Oh no! And the king of Israel sees this prize before him and turns to Elisha and says, "Can I smite him, boss? Can I smite him? Huh? And Elijah tells him no, to keep it in his pants, give them a meal and send them on their way home. Which, makes perfect sense with an enemy army. But apparently it does make sense, because they eat, they go home, and they never come back. Except that apparently they do come back, because the king of Syria gets grouchy after this and lays siege to Samaria. And while it's under siege, there is this massive food shortage in Samaria, which means that grocery store prices shoot through the roof. So while the king's out walking the parapets one day, some woman comes up to him and starts begging for food, basically saying, "If God doesn't help me, maybe you can. How do I earn my keep around here?" Now the king is apparently kind of sharp, because he gives her this look, he can tell that there's more to this story, so he asks her what's really going on. And the story she tells is horrific. See, like we said, there's a famine in this city, and it's gotten pretty bad, because the deal she made with one of her neighbors is that they're going to boil her son and eat him, and then the next day they'll boil and eat the neighbor's son. Kind of sounds like something out of Silence of the Lambs, doesn't it? So the first day, they boil and eat her kid. Baby, the other white meat. So the next day she goes over to the neighbor lady's house and says, all right, let's boil up your son, and the bitch put her kid in hiding. I'm not saying I condone the eating of small children or anything, but if you make a bargain, your word is your bond. So when the king hears about this, he does that tearing his clothes thing that they do so often to show that they're upset, and then he says, you see this sack? Because he's holding a sack. If I don't have the head of Elisha in this sack by tonight, God shall deal with me. As near as I can tell, what he's saying is that Elisha, as God's agent, should have been able to stop this atrocity, but he didn't. So after hearing the story about the boiled babies, the king gets kind of grouchy and says, well, Elijah's gonna die. So Elisha is hiding out in his house with a bunch of village elders when a messenger knocks on the door. And Elijah's like, don't let that dude in, because behind him is the king who's gonna take off my head. Well, the king shouts through the door at him, this whole disaster comes from God. Why should I wait for him to get up off his ass and help? And Elijah basically tells them to chill out because food prices are gonna plummet tomorrow morning. Now, naturally, of course, the king and his entourage, after having seen the devastation of the city, are a tiny bit skeptical of this claim. In fact, one of them, some lord, speaks up and asks Elijah why they should believe him in the first place. And as near as I can tell, because this book is written really poorly, Elisha turns to the nobleman and says, well, you'll get to see the food, but you don't get to eat it. So now we cut to just outside the city gate, where 4 men with leprosy, and what is it with this book about leprosy, are going over their basic options. So the way they figure it, they can sit outside the city gate forever and die, or they can try to get into the city where there's famine, and they'll die, or they can go try to get food from the Syrians, who might kill them, and they'd die, or maybe the Syrians would let them live and give them a wee bit of eatins. So having figured out the best of their options, the lepers all go over to the Syrian camp, and find it completely deserted. See, what happened is that God had made the sound of a great army thundering down upon them, and the Syrians flipped out and decided to run away, leaving just about everything else behind them. So the lepers, they find the mess tent, and boy, do they ever chow down. But then they go into some of the other tents and start taking some of the rich stuff. So they go into a couple of the tents, and they steal gold and silver and clothing, and stash it all somewhere that they can find it easily later. But then they start to have kind of a twinge of conscience. You know, what we're doing here isn't exactly right. We really should tell somebody before morning or we'll be cursed. Let's go find a member of the king's household. So they found a guy who could get a message to the king and told him that the Syrian camp was completely empty except for stuff and horses and mules. So eventually the message gets to the king and he's all, don't believe it for a minute, guys. We go out there and they'll ambush us. I saw that Trojan horse crap. So one of the king's officers convinces him to send out a small scout party to find out what's going on, because if they don't, well, chances are good they're still going to starve. So the scout party goes out, and they search through the Syrian camp and find it completely deserted just as promised. In fact, they follow the trail of the Syrians and discover that they left these huge cargo ships just full of treasure. No one to be found. So they send messengers back to the king explaining that the Syrians, in their haste to get the hell out of there, just left everything behind. So the city doors open, everyone goes out and collects up a whole bunch of stuff. Food prices drop, and everyone eats for like a shekel each, just as promised by God through Elisha. Oh yeah, and Elijah told that one nobleman that he would see the food but wouldn't eat any of it. Yeah, he kind of got trampled by the crowd and died. Seems a perfectly reasonable punishment for just having a tiny smidge of skepticism, huh? And that is 2 Kings 6-7. And that is definitely a good stopping point. My goodness, 2 Kings is exhausting. So until next time, fellow space travelers, this is BionicDance, reading the Bible so you don't have to. Reading videos has been found to cause fresher breath, enhanced metabolism, and greater sexual magnetism.